Today we're going to be discussing realism in American literature. Realism is a movement within American literature, which we usually use to split American literature in half. In American Lit 1, we talk about Puritan movements, transcendentalism, and literature leading up to the Civil War. Realism is where we begin, usually when we discuss American Lit 2. However, before we get into the different attributes of realism itself, we're going to go through a brief recap of the movements that were predominant in the United States before realism so that we can best understand it. There's a couple different parts of background that we're going to look at. The first is some of the literary background to pre-Civil War America. America was still young. 1864 was only around 100 years after our founding as a nation. There had been American writers, obviously, before we were technically our own country. However, America was still young and finding its literary voice. This means that realism is really one of the first strong movements where we have writers across America all writing within the same style. However, before realism took place, there was a couple movements which are especially noted by specialists looking at this era. The first movement is Puritan literature. Puritan influence on the literature in the United States had discouraged fiction works because they thought that fiction was unhealthy and it didn't really lead to a good religious or moral life. However, additionally, they didn't like women to be involved in literature. This means there would be few female characters, and the literature that females were allowed to read was often clear with an unambiguous moral. Even if it was a fictitious novel, it was especially important because of the Puritan influence that it had a very strong religious purpose that was clear to the reader. One of the second things to understand about the United States and our literature pre-Civil War is transcendentalism. Transcendentalist authors like Walt Whitman and Ralph Waldo Emerson are especially notable. The belief in the goodness of man was one of the key pillars of transcendentalism, which made much of its literature very optimistic in nature and in its tone. This meant a lot of its literature believed that there would be inevitable progress. Ralph Waldo Emerson is famous for talking about the eternal spark in man, which is a very optimistic idea compared to some of the literature that we'll be looking at later. Another key facet of transcendentalism is nature. Often there was very pantheistic beliefs of transcendental authors, which caused them to write about the importance of communion with nature, as well as this romantic ideal about when we're out in nature, we are our best selves and our most moral selves. So this is just a very brief recap about transcendentalism and what the literary background to realism is in the United States. However, when we turn to look at the attitudes of realism, the third and most important thing other than Puritan and transcendental beliefs in order to understand is that of the Civil War. The impact of the Civil War on Americans and American literature is almost incalculable. There's a couple different things which this great atrocity in our history caused Americans to do. The first was to question this inevitable progress or the goodness of man. Although transcendental writers kept thinking we're going up, up, and up, and we're getting better and better, after the Civil War and brother fighting against brother, this type of belief was much less prevalent. They also don't have the same belief in progress or optimism. But another thing which had a huge impact on the United States after the Civil War was Lincoln's assassination. What little confidence the American people did have in progress was essentially crushed because his assassination served as a double blow, a double punch to the American psyche during this time, causing even more pessimistic belief. You can see this in a couple different works. Walt Whitman and his "O Captain, My Captain," his "When Lilacs Last and the Dooryard Bloomed" are both poems that you could turn to get an idea of the impact that Lincoln and his assassination had on the American people. So literature begins shifting after the Civil War from Puritanism, Romanticism, or Transcendentalism into what we call realism. There's a few different attributes of realism which are important to understand the literature that was written during this time. William Dean Howells is perhaps the most influential man in American literature, which we'll be looking at later, during this time period. And it was he who stated that realism is nothing more and nothing less than true interpretation and treatment of material. Essentially, what he's saying in this quotation is that realism is just honesty. Not to say that transcendental authors or Puritan authors didn't think they were being honest, but realist authors were especially careful to interpret the world the way that they saw it. This can be seen in their characters, their plot, as well as their settings. Let's first turn and discuss the characters of realist literature. Characters within realist literature, both in their exterior and interior attributes, were very honest, realistic, like your average middle-class, everyday American. Their exteriors couldn't have any amazing appearance or talents. They couldn't be especially good-looking or have a lot of wealth because they wanted to be like your average Joe. Also, what was going on in the interior nature of a character had to be realistic and common. Although princesses fighting evil dragons and princes coming in to rescue them, back in the time were very entertaining. During the realist movement, we see no such myths or legends, or even something like Natty Bumppo would be considered unrealistic. What goes on in the psyches of those characters within fairy tales was not relatable enough, which is why during the realist movement, the different conflicts which characters come into have to be something that your average person could sympathize with. Their beliefs couldn't be out of the ordinary, and their psychological struggles couldn't be out of the ordinary. Beyond the characters, the plots of works of realism in literature are also very average, honest, and realistic. The time frame of these plots had to be contemporary. They usually were within 50 years or so of when the work and the piece was written. There couldn't be any wild romances. They had to avoid cliché and overly happy endings in order to be an honest or realistic piece of literature. This doesn't mean that the endings of realistic stories are never emotionally satisfying. It simply means that they can't be artificial. It has to be something that the reader could picture happening or maybe had seen in their own lives in order to be a realist work. Additionally, the conflicts that happen within the plot had to be something which your average reader might have had themselves or known someone to have had. So when we look at Freytag's different kinds of conflicts, so man versus man, this couldn't be anything out of the ordinary. You're not going to have works about Napoleon versus one of his henchmen or something like that. That is not an average experience. Therefore, that conflict wouldn't really be written about during realist time period in the United States. Additionally, the conflicts of man versus nature had to be something which your average American could have experienced. An irregular storm, hurricane could be believable, something that Americans experienced, but you couldn't have anything too crazy or out of the ordinary. Additionally, man versus himself, those interior psychological struggles, which we talked a little bit about when we were talking about characters and their interior nature, had to be something which your average Joe, your American in literature, could have also experienced. Third, when we look at the settings of realist stories, they were often easy for the reader to picture in their mind. The descriptions were almost documentary-like in the way that writers during realist literature would walk their readers through. Not only were they easy to picture, often these different settings or real life places or inspired by real life places. There's not going to be any never ever ever land or any made up countries when you're looking at a work of realist literature. Alright, so next we're going to turn to a branch of realist literature which is known as local color. Local color is a reaction to these waves of change that were taking place in the United States that we talked about at the beginning of this lecture. All of this change in the United States meant that different pockets of culture that we had in the United States, whether it was based off ethnicity or socioeconomic status, were often threatened, whether it be because of new people who were moving in, the economic overhaul that happened after the war. All of these different things caused what used to be somewhat isolated pockets of the United States to become infiltrated with foreigners, which meant that authors felt they had to in some way pay tribute to their own culture that they had in their location. Even today, when you think about the United States, what comes to mind for you as being American culture might be different from someone else. Someone from Southern California is going to have a different idea of American color and culture than someone who's from Texas or New England. So what we see in local color literature within realism is focusing on that different pocket, those different pockets where perhaps the author had grown up, and it's their way of paying tribute or talking about those areas. There's 5 different things which local color authors usually would include in their work. They might not include all of the following 5, but these are what we generally turn to and refer to. The first is social norms. As you know today, there's different social norms depending on what area of the country you're in. So this is going to change from our different areas and our different pieces of literature during this time period. The second thing that these authors would write about was the religious customs of these areas, or if it was an area that was reasonably unchurched or not religious, then they would talk about the lack of religion in that area. The third thing we see in local color literature is the economic realities that people in that area would face. The economy in the South after the Civil War was very different from the economy in the cities that were growing up north or along the coast during the Civil War. So this would change from time to time when we're looking at these pieces of literature as well. Fourth, these local color authors would talk about the linguistic nuances and the different dialects that they had within their different pockets of the country. This is still somewhat true today. If you go to somewhere in the deep south or Oklahoma, people are going to be speaking differently than they would if you're up north by Canada or perhaps out east in New York City. We have our different accents, the different pieces of vocabulary that you have today. And during this time period, local color authors wanted to make their work authentic and realistic by including those linguistic nuances and their dialects. The fifth and final thing which local color authors always included in their work was a geographic explanation, description, the features of that area which were specific to that area. So if we're looking at someone like Mark Twain, we're going to be getting a description of the South. If we're looking at Sarah Orne Jewett or someone who is writing from New England, then we're going to have very different descriptions. So all of these local color authors would focus on these different things in their work, which is not to say that an author who wasn't a local colorist would never include these things, but they weren't as prominent or well explained as they would be in a local color author's piece of work. Now, you might be asking why local color authors felt the need to preserve their area, their locale, or talk about it. There's 4 different motivations that we look at when we're examining a local color author and their fiction. The first reason that local color authors would write is to celebrate the unique heritage of that culture. Whether it was someone like Zitkala Sa, who was an American Indian who saw the different infiltrations happening with her society, or someone like Mark Twain in the South, sometimes they would want to celebrate and say, this heritage is uniquely ours. It's American. It is just as legitimate as any other explanation of the world and the way that it works, or any other culture's ideas. It's a way of celebrating their culture and the way that it worked. The second motivation that a local color author might have had would be to advocate for assimilation into mainstream culture. This might not be as frequent as celebrating culture, but some local colorists said, yes, this way of life was beautiful, but it doesn't work anymore. It's not as legitimate or justified or practical in order to survive in the modern era and what was happening then. The third motivation of a local color author would be reactionary against the change which they saw. It would be saying, we have to preserve things the way we are. So it goes further than just celebrating the culture. It's reactionary. It's saying this other way of assimilating is actually wrong and should not be pursued. The fourth and final motivation of a local color author or artist would be corrective. What this means is that it is correcting the narrative that had been happening about that culture. The example we're going to look at here is Mark Twain, who is seen as a corrective author. He doesn't necessarily celebrate Missouri or the South or their way of life in his works like Tom Sawyer or Huckleberry Finn. What he's trying to do is be honest and say, you know, life down here maybe isn't quite as great or moral or religious as all these other authors and all these other people are saying. Let me tell you how it really is. So that's what we see with a corrective local colorist. So this is just a brief overview of what local color literature is. But it's important to understand local color because when we look at realism and the idea that we're presenting the world as it is, we need to understand that might look different from place to place throughout the country. But that doesn't necessarily mean that those different works are not equally realistic. Just because one is optimistic compared to another that's pessimistic, that's not necessarily what it means to be realist. To be a realist means you're presenting the world the way that you see it within your different culture during this time in American literature. We're not going to get too in-depth with a couple different realist authors, but we're just going to mention a few and why they were important in American literature. The first author, which cannot be overlooked when we're talking about realist literature, is William Dean Howells, whose quotation I mentioned at the beginning of the lecture. William Dean Howells started out in a pretty average, normal middle-class family, which is very realistic when you look at overall how the United States was doing at that time. He was an editor for a newspaper. He actually wrote President Lincoln's campaign biography, which is a little interesting fact about him. Additionally, the most important thing about William Dean Howells is that he actually became the editor for the Atlantic Monthly, which was probably the most read magazine in the United States, or publication, at that time. As the editor of the Atlantic Monthly, he had a unique influence on shaping the American perception of what was good literature. Because whatever he thought was good, he would publish and put into the Atlantic Monthly, and then the rest of the United States would read and assume that this is what literature should be like. So as the Dean of Letters, the editor of the Atlantic Monthly, William Dean Howells was incredibly influential. When you look at many of the different authors that I'm going to briefly mention, one thing that most of them have in common is that they met and were published by William Dean Howells. So although he might not have as many of his own writings as some of these other authors, he was still the most influential man in realist literature. A couple other important realist authors, we're going to look at Bret Harte because he focused on the farther west area in the United States. He wrote about gold rush camps in northern California. And when you think about, miners out in the wilderness, it's often what he would write about. His most famous work is The Luck of the Roaring Camp, which he wrote when he lived out west where his family had moved. And it's documenting, through local color, what life was like within these miner settlements. Although he actually kind of wanted to change the type of literature that he wrote about, people loved The Luck of the Roaring Camp so much that it was pretty unsuccessful whenever he tried to change from realism or local color to something else, which just shows how prominent realist literature was at that time. Another important local colorist is Charles Chesnutt, who is famous for writing The Wife of His Youth, which deals with the story of a perhaps biracial or African American man who is passing as being white or Caucasian, although that's not who he truly is. And the reason that this piece of work was important for Charles Chesnutt is because he himself was from a freed African American family. However, he is very, very, very pale skinned and could pass as a white man if he wished to. So the idea of biracialism, of these different layers of race and what they mean, which was very important in the United States at that time, is something which we see a lot of in Charles Chesnutt's literature. As I already mentioned, Mark Twain was one of the realist authors who wrote corrective fiction. He's especially famous for his works, The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, as well as Huckleberry Finn. He grew up in Missouri, which was an interesting state pre and during the Civil War because it was kind of in limbo in regards to slavery. And Mark Twain kind of corrected people's ideas about Missouri and this area of the South in his work. His work is known for being very cutting, very sarcastic, and satirical, which just goes to show that he was trying to write things the way they really were, not in a rosy-eyed view of the world or of the South. Sarah Orne Jewett is another local colorist. She grew up in Maine, so she wrote about that area of the United States. She is one of few women during this time period who had access to equal education. This was paid for by her grandfather, who was a captain and a merchant, and he ultimately saw the value in her education, which is why her life was a lot more optimistic than some other authors were, and so her literature was more of the celebratory nature of local color that I mentioned earlier. Last but not least, there's Mary Wilkins Freeman, who also grew up in the New England area. However, her family, which was Puritan, was far, far more strict than Sarah Orne Jewett's, where she was sent to a female seminary. It's actually the same seminary where Emily Dickinson had been sent. And much like Emily Dickinson, Mary Wilkins Freeman dropped out because she hated her life there so much. She lost 3 of her siblings during childhood. Her family lost all of their wealth, which within the Puritan community was seen as God's way of punishing them. So she really had a lot of hardships growing up. She lost her mother and father, so all of her family by the time she turned 30. Which is why when we look at her literature, it is going to be much darker and much more pessimistic than that of Sarah Orne Jewett or perhaps another author writing during this period. These are by no means all of or the most important realist authors, but they're just a couple ones that are important to understanding realism in literature. So to sum up, when we look at American literature from 1864 onward, a couple of decades, what we see throughout most of the literature written at this time period is realism, which seeks not to paint the world as it should be or as we wish it was, but simply as it is.